So Charles Leclerc secured the first pole position for Ferrari in the 2023 Formula One season, and he did that in style. In a session that, well, for all intents and purposes, it did appear that Red Bull had the edge, and it was either going to be Max Verstappen or Sergio Perez who was going to secure pole position. Out of the blue, in arguably in vintage Charles Leclerc fashion, it was him producing a stunning lap at the dying stages that helped him secure pole position. Now, not many people will even remember that this was something that he used to do in the 2022 F1 season as well. And in quite a few occasions, he was able to steal the final pole position lap at the very end. This time around as well, at Baku, he was able to accomplish that. Now, it was not only that, there were quite a few other things that happened during the session. It was more or less a chaotic session, and what we had was, well, Pierre Gasly crashing out, we had Nick De Vries having a crash, and, well, not only that, we had issues with for Kevin Magnussen and others as well. Overall, it was a bit chaotic, and maybe, I'm not entirely sure, maybe there was probably a sense of a singular practice session playing a role. Maybe, I'm not entirely sure, and we need to look at probably a few more races to ultimately reach a conclusion. But yeah, it did appear that teams were underprepared. And yeah, more unpredictability for us, and probably more action as well. Although the red flags were a bit too much, I agree. Having said that, the session overall was a bit fun. It had a bit of a feel good factor as well, with Leclerc securing his first pole position and first true trophy for the 2023 season, in which he has, well, other than the race in Australia, he has been driving decently. It's not like he's off the mark or something like that. He's been doing a decent job. So yeah, a lot of things happened. The main purpose of this video is just its basic recap. It is me just having an instant reaction of what happened in qualifying and just giving my take on those things. So yeah, I'll try to keep it short, not take too much of your time, and do let me know what you guys think as well. So now, first of all, recapping what happened in qualifying. Well, at the end of it, when the final checkered flag fell, we had Charles Leclerc on pole position by a gap of about 2 tenths from Max Verstappen. We had Sergio Perez in P3. We had Carlos Sainz in P4, but almost a second slower than the lap time that Charles Leclerc was able to put together. Then we had Lewis Hamilton in P5, almost a second behind the pole position lap. Fernando Alonso was even slower in P6. It should be a bit disappointing for them. Then we had a surprise in Lando Norris being in P7 with a lap that was almost good enough to beat both Aston Martin and Mercedes. Then Yuki Tsunoda, another surprise in P8. Lance Stroll was P9. Oscar Piastri P10. In P11, another surprise, George Russell, a surprise elimination. In P12, we had Esteban Ocon from Alpine, another surprise elimination. Usually the team does perform well and reaches Q3. And yes, looking down the list, we can see even Pierre Gasly finishing in P19. Another surprise result. A lot more was expected of him. But yeah, it happens sometimes. So now that we've taken a look at the classification, let's jump straight into the key takeaways. And let's take a look at what we can decipher from the 1 hour qualifying session that we had. Well, now first of all, I think it is safe to say that Charles Leclerc is one of the best drivers on the F1 grid right now. And he is arguably the best qualifier of a Formula 1 car. Now, in the last couple of seasons, I've seen that sometimes Leclerc is a victim of an undue criticism that he tends to face from time to time. More often than not, some things are overlooked. Some things like the fact that he drives for Ferrari, a team that tends to make far too many mistakes, and ends up leaving a driver in a situation where he has to overcompensate with his skills. When that happens, mistakes are bound to happen, and that is what tends to happen with Leclerc. Even then, in the last couple of seasons, while Leclerc's mistakes have been a bit high profile, if you look at it overall, almost every other driver in top 5 made those kinds of mistakes, and some made even more than what Leclerc did. And that's something that tends to be overlooked because, well, yeah, we tend to look at the high point and the low points. His low points were quite bad. Now, coming to the qualifying session, I think we should admit one thing, that Red Bull is arguably the better car of the two. Not only overall, but even in qualifying as well. Both in Q1 and Q2, it was quite obvious that the car was in the window and it was performing very well. However, in the final lap, for both Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen, both had a yellow sector 2, and that played a major role in Leclerc securing pole position. Having said that, it was Leclerc that delivered when it was needed. He had a very strong sector 1, spectacular sector 2, a sector that both Max as well as Perez fumbled, and then even a strong sector 3, which ultimately helped cement pole position. Now, yeah, what happens in the race, I think we'll come to that later. But if we have to talk about the driver ability, I think Leclerc ranks very highly. And yes, even when we talk about the rumors of probably Leclerc going to Mercedes and replacing Lewis, it can happen. If we talk about purely driver ability, Leclerc can hang with the best of them. And in a more stable environment, he might be able to flourish even more. So, yeah, overall, the first point is dedicated to Charles Leclerc because, well, that was a stunning lap, arguably the best qualifying lap of the entire season until now. Now, the second point, both Red Bull and Max Verstappen might still be out of reach for everyone else. Well, I feel that is going to happen because let's be fair. Even Charles Leclerc admitted that the race pace for Ferrari was probably not in the same bandwidth or even in the same ballpark as what Red Bull would be able to do. Now, there are still some things that Ferrari could accomplish. First of all, if Charles Leclerc is able to secure a pole position again tomorrow in the sprint quali, then he could possibly fend off Max Verstappen over a short stint in the sprint. He could secure maximum amount of points there. But yeah, overall, in terms of the race pace and in terms of what we are going to have in the final Grand Prix on Sunday, Max Verstappen looks unstoppable. More importantly, the reason why that is the case is because, well, Ferrari is struggling in terms of race pace. It does not have that. And looking at the kind of lap time Carlos Sainz did, I mean, that's clear. It should paint a picture that ultimately it was Leclerc outperforming the kind of machinery that he had. And yeah, when we take all these things into consideration and the fact that Max Verstappen tends to do better in the race, it's hard to see anyone stopping Verstappen from winning the final Grand Prix on Sunday. And even when it comes to the sprint, I think the number of laps are going to be enough for Verstappen to, even if, I mean, depending entirely on the kind of qualifying either of the two have. If we have the same grid at the start of the sprint, even then I feel I'll back Verstappen to beat Leclerc and win the sprint as well. So yeah, overall, if we take a look at things, it looks like it's going to be a straight battle for the win between Verstappen and Perez. And if Verstappen is starting ahead, it's hard for Perez to keep up. And yeah, unless something freaky happens, it's going to be a cruise for both the Red Bull drivers. Now the third point is Mercedes, Alpine, and Aston Martin are going to be disappointed. Now, first of all, let's talk about Mercedes. Well, they are almost a second slower than Ferrari, and that is something that should pinch the team because after the kind of performance that the team had at Australia, you have to wonder what happened. Now, yeah, the track characteristics at Australia and in Baku, they are entirely different. The demands are different, and what we can clearly see is that Mercedes tends to struggle in low downforce conditions, even with the fact that it has now a much bigger rear wing compared to others. So yeah, that is there. Ultimately, in terms of long run pace, maybe it might still be competitive, but it won't be competitive enough to challenge Red Bull in any which way. Could it be the second fastest car on the grid? Maybe in races, but yeah, again, still question marks on that front. Having said that, being 1 second slower than Ferrari itself, that is disappointing. And yeah, it should open a few eyes at the Mercedes base because this is not done. You can't be almost a second slower in qualifying than Ferrari. Not at this stage. Now talking about Aston Martin, it's arguably in the same boat. Not much different. It's pretty much doing the same thing that Mercedes did. The pace is not there, and there might be a few signs of alarm as well because Alonso, he was still challenging for P2, P3 in the first three races. Now he'll be starting the race in P6. How does he compare with Mercedes? We don't know. But what is quite obvious is that there is still a long way to go for Aston Martin to even challenge for wins. And what we can also see is that Ferrari and Mercedes, they are not sitting still. So yeah, the challenge is real. Can Aston Martin do a better job? We'll have to wait and watch. At least for now, there are still question marks. Now talking about Alpine, well, it is one disappointing performance after another and one bad luck after another. Now, in my view, it was entirely unfortunate what happened in Australia when the two drivers crashed after having a very strong outing. However, even here, I think it's slightly unfortunate that you have a power unit failure and a hydraulic issue, especially on a weekend when it's a sprint weekend. Then you've brought a bunch of upgrades, and then you're going into qualifying not having the entire information, knowledge, data, however you want to put it, into a qualifying session. Now, at least in my view, I do feel that when these new upgrades are ultimately understood, and you'll see Alpine improving over the weekend, when they are completely understood, you might see the team starting to improve its performance in qualifying as well during the sprint qualifying tomorrow. You might see that. But despite all of that, having one driver get eliminated in Q2, the other not even get out of Q1 and basically start the race at the back row, you have to question that there are some things that need to be put in line, because Alpine has potential, it has pace, but it is not delivering on it. And that is going to hurt the team in the long run as well, because there might come a time when the competitors start catching up, and you don't want that. Now, next, I'm covering both McLaren and AlphaTauri. Well, first of all, talking about McLaren, what a stunning upgrade they've got. The kind of lap time that he put together, it was almost as good as the kind of lap time that Lewis and Alonso put together. So yeah, whatever McLaren has brought, the car is alive and it is performing at a very, very impressive rate. Now, what we need to see, and yeah, again, it could be a false alarm because we've seen a few even in the previous races as well, is the fact that what we need to see at the end of the day is how McLaren performs in the race. We've seen a Q3 appearance from McLaren earlier in the season as well, and it's not a new thing from them. What we need to see is how the race pace evolves, because that is where McLaren has struggled in the last few races. If the team is able to sustain this kind of level of performance, then wow, we are looking at an impressive season from McLaren, because on the other hand, Alpine is struggling. A P5 or a P4 in championship will not be out of reach if McLaren is able to continue doing this. Now, talking about AlphaTauri, it was, well, two different extremes. On one side, you had Yuki Tsunoda, who was stunning in qualifying. There's no doubt the kind of lap time he was putting together. Now, whether it was the car or whether it was the driver, looking at the trend that we've seen in the first three races, you have to credit the driver, because that was very impressive from him. Now, at the same time, you compare it with what Nick DeVries was doing. He was doing a decent job in the free practice session, but if you're going to crash out in Q1 after showing that kind of promise and after being in pressure after what happened in the first three races, things aren't looking good. So yeah, kudos to both Yuki and Franz Tost for having faith in him, and yeah, ultimately for having such an impressive qualifying session as well. Now, finally, talking about my expectation from the rest of the weekend. Well, looking at the track characteristics, looking at how unprepared every team is, and looking at the scope of a sprint race and a sprint quali, and then finally a race, I think I think we should be ready for the kind of chaos that we tend to see in races like these. There will be quite a few stoppages. There are also going to be quite a few reliability issues, something that featured last season as well, and something that appears to be featuring this time around. So yeah, keep these things in mind. Overall, it's going to be a bit of a disruptive race where we're going to see quite a few yellow flags, quite a few safety cars, maybe one or two red flags as well. But yeah, overall, I do feel that the rest of the weekend is going to be a bit chaotic. And maybe, who knows, maybe it helps in having a surprise winner, a surprise podium finisher, a surprise result. If that happens, great, because while I don't really mind Max Verstappen winning a race, I'd love to see a bit of a variation at the top. So yeah, this was my reaction to the qualifying session on a Friday. Do share what you guys think. Let me know in the comment section. Obviously, like, share, subscribe, do all those good things, and thanks for watching. See you next time.